If you're anything like Ratford, then you've consumed a lot of media and likely fairly accustomed to seeing a myriad of premises with gimmicks slapped on. These gimmicks are employed as quick and reliable ways to attract viewers, and Ratford has fallen victim to them more times than he would like to admit. Intrigued by these gimmicks, he would be lured in to find there was nothing much more to offer beyond the initial novelty. The characters are bland, the relationships are lackluster, and the plot is all too familiar. A painful, tired sort of mediocrity. Ratford might as well have watched it already, and it devolves into something only good for, if at all, burning the hours. And truth be told, this type of empty-headed, agreeable diversion was what Ratford expected when he clicked on Mr. Queen. This Korean drama tells the tale of a modern-day chef who, after undergoing a near-death experience, finds his soul has been inexplicably transported into the body of a Joseon-era queen. The bulk of the story follows the chef as he navigates his new role, body, and relationships. And with it being a period piece, he must of course also contend with political power struggles. The show begins by introducing the main character, Bong-hwan. Quite immediately, he's thrust on screen as a guest on a classy TV interview, speaking with such performative acuity that Ratford can't contain his visceral repulsion. His courtly exchange with the host is complete with cutaway shots that flaunt his culinary expertise. The back and forth halts after the host requests he divulge some titillating workplace gossip. The show then switches to a back room where he's attempting to indulge in ill-advised osculating with a coworker and assures her that his astute professionalism has guaranteed no interruptions. With complete confidence in both his skills as a chef and his irresistible allure, he leans in, exercising zero inhibition. As their lips are just shy of contact, something has gone awry with the VIP's meal, and they're disrupted by a commotion outside. He's begrudgingly torn away by work obligations, but before sauntering out, he proclaims his succulent dish must have induced a dire need to grant the chef a personal commendation and pledges a prompt return. After shouldering the responsibility for the incident and being dismissed from his position, he salvages his pride by flippantly shifting the blame. One off-screen development leads to another, and suddenly the police are knocking on Bong-hwan's door for suspected embezzlement. A brief scene with two new characters whose names have only been mentioned no more than 2 times insinuates his misfortunes were schemed, presumably fueled by jealousy and rabid ambition. Bong-hwan asserts he had been framed and refuses to comply, and the 2 officers chase him through his penthouse. This culminates in a string of events that land him on the precarious side of a balcony railing, and, as if on command, a pigeon perching above him empties its bowels, its feculence landing atop his hand, and thus he plummets at least 7 floors. The community pool terminates his nosedive as he is concussed on the concrete floor, and as he's floating in the water believing his end is nigh, his most pressing regret is he hasn't dated enough women yet. This entire intro sequence solidifies his character as a cheeky, superficial fool who's quite self-aggrandizing and whose mind is so very apparently preoccupied with thoughts of women that Ratford's expectations for him are rather low. So far, it was coagulating into a mindless sort of show Ratford would only watch for silly recreation. Granted, it had been a mere 10 minutes into the first episode, a bit premature to form any proper verdict. However, his initial impression was of a stumbling endeavor to paint Bong-hwan as someone eloquent and fetching, and Ratford found it to be quite tawdry and trite. What preserved his attention was the impending soul transfer and the curiosity of how the show would go about it. Now, after having formed a more comprehensive grasp of Mr. Queen's tone, Ratford realizes that the introduction was intentionally using tropes and dramatics to showcase the lead's shortcomings, although there were still holes here and there in the narrative that were distracting. Fortunately, hereafter, the show picks up and is fairly smooth sailing. As Bong-hwan lies suspended in the water, a mysterious woman appears, swimming gradually towards him. Auroras ripple around them, the pool seemingly having expanded a great degree as they share a mystical kiss and the scene fades to black. Bong-hwan then awakens in the palace as the Queen, operating in a state of lucid confusion, and is seen spending his first moments in Joseon contending with the reality of his new body. Unsurprisingly, Bong-hwan's most immediate goal is to return to his own time and personage, and in his desperation, he quickly draws a conclusion based on very limited information. His initial efforts consist of running with reckless abandon around the palace, haphazardly plunging his head into any collection of water he can. When he realizes that it isn't so simple, reverting back becomes the driving force behind his actions during the first half of the season as he carelessly affects the political landscape around him. And evidently, attempting to enthrall women with his innate charms is also a huge motivator. During the latter half of the show, Bong-hwan becomes increasingly swept up in palace life and its scrimmages over power. Having realized a shortage of any avenues through which he can restore his life prior, his choices are instead centered around improving his time as the queen, using his position in history to enact revenge on his modern enemies, and protecting those around him. Additionally, as he continues to acclimate to his new body, his objective shifts to retaining as much of his old identity as possible for fear of losing his original self-image, namely his heterosexuality and, by extension, his manliness. In spite of his best efforts, however, Bonghan still finds himself falling for the king and progressively identifying with the queen. His behavior increasingly pivots from being solely self-serving to more altruistic, and his brazen yet compassionate personality captures the hearts of both his servants and the king. Although Mr. Queen is, at its core, about palace politics and the battle for control over the throne, it takes care to balance its somberly manner with a semi-parody approach. Melodramatics are not entirely done away with, but rather simultaneously juxtaposed and punctuated with spoofs and other humors, with Bonghan as the greatest contributor. He often dismisses his role as the queen and thinks incredibly little of maintaining any sense of similarity between himself and the original inhabitant of this body. He's the type of person to forego nearly everything in disagreement with his character, which would typically translate into his refusal to adapt his demeanor in accordance to the era. Even when he does make an effort to play the part, it usually comes across as theatrical and disingenuous, and ends up comedic anyhow. Bonghan is silly, conceited, and a bit rough, and he's a character Ratford has grown to enjoy. His gruff exterior and wild behavior make him charming in his own way, and despite his egocentric tendencies, he's actually quite a decent person who genuinely cares about his loved ones. As the tale unfolds, Bonghan influences those around him and develops improbable yet earnest bonds, enriching the lives of all those involved. This influence is most plainly seen in the king as they become closer. Their relationship commences in a place that could more accurately be described as adversarial than cordial. The king sees him as a complacent queen, a willing pawn for her corrupt family, and Bonghan sees the king as an obtuse puppet ruler who only desires a life of unfettered indulgence. Over the course of the story, their relationship deepens as they come to understand each other in a way that is reminiscent of Pride and Prejudice. Bonghan challenges the king's perception of the queen as immoral merely on the basis of her arbitrary blood relation to unrighteous relatives, and criticizes his "the end justifies the means" approach to reforming the government. Ratford likes that Mr. Queen doesn't make an unbearably dramatical production out of their romance. It's a personal preference, but his heart is simply not very stirred from watching two people stare at each other while a sweet ballad plays, and the footage consists of a singular moment replaying in slow motion through fading edits from varying angles. It gets tedious after a while, and honestly, he finds it uninteresting. Before long, Ratford disconnects from the emotions in the scene and resigns himself to purely waiting for the show to move on. It wouldn't be all too shocking if Mr. Queen did have its fair share of those moments, however, they were fewer and farther between, and were, most importantly, shorter, so he didn't think them painfully notable. Rather than relying on monotonous shots, Mr. Queen communicates the two leads' chemistry through their dialogue and actions. The king makes an effort to understand Bonghan, and even when he's incapable of comprehending his train of thought, the king accepts him as he is. They fall for each other's qualities beyond simply kindness and flirtation and flirtatious kindness, which are all well and good, but if they're the only things the leads bond over, it begins to feel one-dimensional. What about their hobbies and interests? What values do they share? Ratford finds that many pieces of media within the romance genre don't really touch on how the leads communicate beyond kind gestures and courting, and the relationship that blossoms between them tends to feel shallow to him. That isn't to say that Ratford believes couples must absolutely have shared interests or activities, or that being kind is inherently lacking in depth, but he does tend to wonder what sort of conversations they have when they aren't doing nice things for each other. How do their personalities establish rapport, and what sustains their attraction? Rather than focusing on a surface level "he's nice to me and into me so I like him as well" affinity, they share a more nuanced connection. They learn from each other, they challenge each other, they make mistakes, argue, and find a resolution. And even with their absurd circumstances, prevalent misunderstandings, and the sometimes cliché and ostentatious depiction, their partnership feels more compelling than many other fictional couplings Ratford has seen. Another aspect of Mr. Queen that Ratford finds delight in is the treatment given to the friendships Bonghan forms. The attention allocated to how his connections with side characters arise, progress, and strengthen produces something of a found family. Similar to the king, almost every character Bonghan comes into contact with are initially taken aback, at times offended or even horrified by his behavior and speech. As the show goes on, however, they realize his unconventionality is simply who he is. They come to embrace all his facets and put in the effort to understand him, albeit begrudgingly for some. Bonghan's friendships and the screen time set aside for the side characters helps the show avoid revolving solely around Bonghan's romance with the king. An additional gripe that Ratford has with some media within the romance genre is the heroine's gradual decline in personhood. Her personality, goals, and in more extreme cases, character as a whole is relegated to the back burner as a way to communicate the intensity of the couple's blossoming love. The heroine then fades away into an empty version of the supposed complex individual teased in the premise, resulting in all her attributes becoming merely tools to be used in setting the scene or pushing the plot with very little significance otherwise. The writing of Mr. Queen does a decent job of ensuring neither the relationship nor the king engulfs Bong-han's individuality, and as with the side characters, he retains his own life independent of romance. As much as Ratford enjoyed the show, there are a smattering of details he thought could have been done better. Although Mr. Queen is deliberate in its use of tropes as humor, and Ratford is cognizant of the fact that humor is subjective in nature, an appreciable number of the bits were either somewhat crass or induced secondhand embarrassment, and the handling of a few developments felt a little mediocre. One scene in particular was considerably glaring. At the end of the second to last episode, the two leads are hiding within a cart in order to sneak back into the palace. A sense of suspense is fabricated by implying they're on the cusp of being discovered by one of the villains. The only reason this tension exists in the scene is due to the editing, which presents to the viewers a cart being inspected while another, containing the leads, is being opened. They omit the context to make it seem as if the two carts are one and the same, but there is a discrepancy that makes this whole thing obsolete. While the trapdoor to the king and Bong-han's cart is being lifted, an antagonist is aiming his sword with the intention of stabbing the other. If this suspense is built on deceiving the audience so that they believe the carts are the same, then having a completely different action being taken by the opposing party simply created confusion for Ratford. It appeared as if they used an interaction that just happened to be occurring simultaneously to mislead the audience without much consideration beyond that. Ratford doesn't really see the point in going this far to construct this type of cliffhanger, as not only did it come off as an impertinent addition, but it is, moreover, simply incongruent in execution. While it fulfilled its role of qualifying Bong-han, the intro sequence seemed a bit unpolished and hasty. For instance, upon the arrival of a Chinese ambassador, a staff member enters the kitchen with an interpreter in tow, bearing the message that his employer has a particular aversion towards bones in his fish. Bong-han is indignant, reading this indubitably inane request as a slight against his masterful skills, and so replies with a disrespectful remark and is saved by the translator. When he turns away to resume his work, he offhandedly compares the ambassador to an emperor who was infamously picky. Despite the staff member recognizing the emperor's name, repeating it back, presumably offended, and Bong-han's acknowledgement of the staff member's reaction, his remark goes unaddressed and is simply made into another segue. Back in the interview, he just delves into his philosophical views on the gravity of food, and that is that. What began as a demonstration of Bong-han's haughty attitude morphed into an unresolved interaction. Furthermore, Ratford remains unsure where in the timeline this interview takes place. Initially, it seems like the interview is the present and the cutaways are the past, but as the opening progresses, the cutaways start becoming the present and the interview falls into some sort of vague time zone. Ratford proceeded with the assumption that everything following the interviewer's request, basically the entire show, was what Bong-han was recounting and it would close out by returning to the interview, but alas. There are plot developments that also come across as a bit contrived. The most conspicuous affair was when the king staged his own assassination by putting gunpowder in a censer. He was quite close to the bomb, which produced a fairly sizable blast, and clearly sustained injuries. He received treatment and, in an emotionally weighty scene, discloses he can no longer hear. The king remains out of commission for about 3/4 of an episode, and while Ratford doesn't expect such a major character to be locked behind a period of recovery for any terribly extended time frame, this span felt notably meager. Furthermore, Ratford was eager to see how palace politics and the king's blossoming relationship with Bong-han would change in light of the injuries he sustains from the assassination attempt. Much to his disappointment, the king emerges from the aftermath practically unscathed, experiencing no significant lasting effects. Indeed, his condition appears identical to prior to the assassination, save a couple small bandages that, by the closing scene, have been removed to reveal a model-esque complexion. What's more, circumstantial evidence indicates that the king never had severe hearing loss, and if any, it was resolved within a couple hours at most. Ratford understands that the severity of his wounds was purposefully exaggerated, and his hearing loss was more than likely staged to draw his enemies into a false sense of security. However, it all still seemed lacking. Despite being within an arm's reach of the explosion, not only does the king fully recover without any scars or lingering health issues, but the incident resolves fairly neatly within a single episode. The show moves on soon after, almost as if it never happened, and the return to routine is smooth and effortless. Ratford isn't by any means advocating for the king's death, but the unwillingness to let him suffer any repercussions starts to strip the show of tension. He's shielded by plot armor and there are no substantial risks. His success then becomes less a product of meticulous calculation and more a conveniently inevitable matter of course, and it begins to feel like an overstatement of the king's intelligence and capabilities. Some type of permanent fallout, something he must grapple with, but that he brought upon himself, would have been an interesting addition to his role as a ruler and the sacrifices he feels he must make, an idea the show had already introduced. It was a missed opportunity to expand on an existing idea and exhibit how a character lives with meaningful consequences. In the introductory sequence, Bong-hwan was presented as someone with subpar morality in conventional terms, and as Ratford was writing the script, he found it difficult to delineate precisely how the king was the catalyst for Bong-hwan's personal development. After more thought, Ratford has noticed that the manner in which Mr. Queen characterizes him could just as easily be interpreted as a slow reveal of his good qualities, and so perhaps there wasn't much to develop in the first place. Bong-hwan then becomes a mildly wayward protagonist whose flaws can be viewed as closer to eccentric than immoral, causing his emotional growth to be vague and blurry. Ratford would rather have had Bong-hwan possess substantial shortcomings and feels that the addition of modern enemies from his workplace were more trouble than they were worth. Other than serving as a lukewarm motivation for the main character, they didn't feel incredibly pertinent to the plot, and one of his enemies from the first episode never appears again, to Ratford's knowledge. He thinks that doing away with these modern villains entirely and reworking the VIP incident to truly be Bong-hwan's fault would have contributed more in building a clearer growth arc. Having the incident explained by shadowy design absolves him of any blame and could have instead been applied to shape him into someone so arrogant that it's detrimental to both himself and others, further supplementing his obstinate temperament. Although there is an overarching shift in his behavior from manipulation for personal gain to working in tandem to better society, Bong-hwan never suffered any negative outcomes due to his self-serving motives. In fact, he largely exacted positive change while striving towards selfish ends, which made his conceitedness virtually inconsequential. This lack of a tangible impact meant that the amendment to his modern life, from being a suspect of embezzlement to a key witness with police protection as a result of his time in Joseon, was a bit perplexing. Barring the technicalities of time travel, if Bong-hwan had always mostly simulated moral decency, why did his present change, and why did meeting the king improve him to such a degree? Within a tangential vein, the king is constructed as an astute patron of justice, who, in order to conceal his intent to expunge government corruption, is masquerading as a fool. This is made quite unambiguous and positioned as a crucial component to his success, yet it felt as if the show's dedication to maintaining his incompetent pushover persona fell away fairly early on. Some of his actions seemed to directly conflict with his facade, and especially since he was in the presence of those he was deceiving, these instances resembled more a show of power or technical ability, as if the king merely had a sudden and irresistible yearning to feel suave and outwardly served little purpose beyond that. He would pretend to be engrossed in deciphering a text held upside down and would frequently misquote proverbs, but when nudged with veiled hostility, he would often react with poorly disguised discernment, which struck Ratford as unconvincing. What's more, even prior to ruling out Bong-hwan as a threat, the king seemed to lose his sense of caution and interrogated him fervently.
How did you put your name in the goblet of fire?
Although one could argue that this can be explained away by desperation and the fear of his plans unraveling, the development felt premature and impulsive. It came as no surprise to Ratford that the king's adversaries grew suspicious of him before the halfway point of the season. At the culmination of Bong-hwan's romance with the king, as his identity crisis resolves and a sliver of what their future together could be is peeking above the horizon, he's forcibly ejected from the queen's body and returns to his own. He then, freshly out of a coma, frantically searches for any reference to the king in a bookstore. Just after finding his name in a paperback volume, the show returns to Joseon, except Bong-hwan isn't there anymore. The queen's soul has regained control over her body, and the rest of history unfolds. Ratford somewhat expected him to re-inhabit his original body eventually, and so wasn't terribly flabbergasted when it did occur. However, as he watched the climax come and pass, and as palace life resumed without Bong-hwan, a vague sense of melancholy emerged within him. The queen isn't the person the king came to love, and he will never again be in the company of that person. Sure, some of Bong-hwan's personality influenced the queen and she now utilizes profanity, but the fact remains that she is not Bong-hwan. The king lives the rest of his days missing someone he never knew left, and Bong-hwan will be mourning someone who died ages before he was even born. Ratford found the conclusion to be personally unsatisfactory and would have preferred if Bong-hwan remained in Joseon indefinitely. Having Mr. Queen fall into the staple ubiquitous in time travel romances of star-crossed lovers uncoupled by differing eras gave the show another layer of vapid conventionality. Ratford was quite partial to the concept of identity fluidity over in several scenes and wished the show had followed through with the idea that who the Queen and Bonghan were separately and who they could have been is of little consequence in their current reality. A resolute exploration on the creation of a new, amalgamated individual and the resulting death of the original two would have better aligned with the drama's theme of opposing the status quo. This would have also bolstered the underlying thread of feminism the show carried throughout. Rather than have a man drop in and prompt the advancement of women's rights, then leave having fulfilled his mission as a savior, the amalgamated queen could have worked together with her maids as women to accomplish these same goals. Although, most of the women still adhere to traditional notions by and large. Even so, Ratford believes that challenging normalcy and convention were core aspects of Mr. Queen's messaging, and to settle on an outcome so comfortable and tidy as a regression to their former roles felt wasteful, as if the insight and introspection and progressiveness were only desirable up to a certain threshold. Mr. Queen is far from perfect. It has flawed writing, crude jokes, and a lackluster conclusion. Following classic outlines from the genres of time travel and body swaps, it cannot really be called unique either. Although it didn't brandish anything monumental and at times was quite cliché, Ratford still enjoyed it. The incorporation of psychological and philosophical concepts was interesting, despite not being terribly contemplative. The cast, relationships, and antics were typically entertaining, and following the lead's romance as it mounted was charming. It proved to be more than the agreeable diversion Ratford initially predicted. Ratford understands that the severity of his wounds was purposefully exaggerated and his hearing loss was more than likely staged. Why is there a comma there?